One of the guys that will be out there as we get ready later this week will be Tom Murphy, one of your colleagues, Clay. He joins us here on the Morning Rush on a Hot Take Monday. Tom, good morning. I know later this week, all the fun time, all the summer fun is over. It's all the heavy lifting that begins later this week as practice will get underway.
It really does, but it's come a long way since today's the two-a-days and feeling burned up at night and really, really tired as someone who covers practices. It's a new animal, and, of course, we don't see near as much practice anymore these days. But hopefully we'll get to see some of the scrimmaging and, be able to provide good reports to the people.
We talk a lot about depth chart and quarterback battles and position battles, and I'm not saying those aren't important because they obviously are very important to watch throughout the course of a camp. But what are some of the more important things with 5 new staff members, Sam Pittman going into his second year? What are some other things that are interesting to you these first 3, maybe 5, 10 days of camp?
One thing that I keep coming back to is that how well prepared they were to open the season. I mean, they're taking on Georgia, the favorite in the East, a team that was, pretty much a romper-stomper for the last several years under Kirby Smart. And I know they started a quarterback who they had high hopes for, DeJuan Mathis, but maybe just wasn't the right fit. And his accuracy was a little off. Buster Brown picked him off in the first half on a ball that was thrown wide. But they were just well prepared. And they had a game plan for the next week that would be the marker thrown down to how to contain Mississippi State when LSU had apparently no idea how to slow them down. So they were just super well prepared, and I just think all the players expecting or understanding what's expected of them, and same with the coaching staff, that they're going to be able to have their game plans ready to go and rep when they get into game weeks, and and it's all about toughness. Now I'm looking for some really cool position battle, like the offensive guards between Clary and Jones and Latham and Limmer. You got 4 guys battling for some guard spots. I would love to see guys like Marcus Henderson and Tykeus Crawford start pushing guys for playing time on that at tackle. So, and on the defensive line, so many reps to be won and game reps to be won from transferring guys, and Isaiah and Dorian Gerald, Eric Gregory, guys who are coming back that have to beat out the guys for snaps at the defensive line spots.
Tom, this is Clay. Do you hold out Jalen Catalon and Grant Morgan and some of these guys? Do you is this a camp that you're testing toughness again?
Good question.
Well, that's a great question. And I think coaches have been more in recent years, like say Rakeem Boyd comes back last year. He didn't get banged around in the lead up to the season as much as some other guys. So, no, I wouldn't put Grant Morgan in a bunch of one-on-one drills and have live tackling all throughout every live tackling period that they're given leading up to the first game. And there's a few others that I think fall into that category, but Jalen Catalon is still pretty young. I wouldn't let him go in and hit people and, get himself a suspension.
Suspended for practice. For targeting.
Y'all know what I'm saying. I mean, lay off a little bit, Jalen. I really think that both of his were just so borderline. The LSU one, God, here we go on a different tangent. That LSU one was such a game changer because, without that call, maybe they stopped that drive and, it's a tie game at that point. And anyway, he just has to be a smarter tackler this year.
Tom, do you feel like Devion Warren is good to go and he can be, that great number 2 guy that, they lost Mike Woods, that can give them an option outside of Treylon Burks that makes people honor, the other side of the field or the guy outside of Treylon, however they choose to play him?
Right, and that's a great question. One of the big pieces going into the season is, can Arkansas do enough offensively to keep Treylon Burks from being bracketed, doubled, or whatever they might try to do? Just keep that guy from beating them. Because I think oftentimes in man coverage, the quarterback can get away with throwing the ball just a little wide for Burks or a little high and trust that he can beat somebody and get the ball. But I think you asked this question of Sam when we were up in Harrison for the Razorback Club event about Devion, and he feels good about him being close to back to 100%, and made it a point to say he was our second best receiver. Probably a little bit angered at Mike Woods for transferring.
A little bit.
Yeah.
And it's funny, Clay, after he says that, he also says, and by the way, if you enter the portal, when I'm the head coach, you can forget about coming back to the team.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's a tough stance. A lot of coaches sometimes will, if you're a star player, they might go, we can talk about this. But Sam has drawn a line in the sand. So beware, Razorback players. Don't enter the portal if you have doubts or reservations.
Tom Murphy with us here on a Hot Take Monday, brought to you by Wheels RV. Tom, we think about a year ago, and I'll ask both you guys this question. I mean, practice wasn't set to begin in early August. We were battling the pandemic. The season had been pushed back. We were a little more hopeful than we had been a month previous about actually having the season. I mean, the world was in such a different place 365 days ago than where we are on the week of practice beginning this year. No spring practice last year versus having it this year. So that leads me into asking this question, and I'll ask it first to you, Tom, then Clay, why don't you give us your thoughts too. How much further along is the team at this point today on August 2nd, 2021 versus a year ago? How big is that gap? We know they're further down the road. How big is that gap, Tom?
I think they've, as I touched on in my talking about the Georgia game, I think they're well along, and finding guys that can play at D-line is going to be one of the primary objectives of this camp, and making sure they get KJ comfortable in what they're running so he can complete 55 to 60% of his passes so they can keep people off the run game. I mean, you've got to have some balance. But like I mentioned, I do think they're, for a first-year staff last year, they were so well prepared given all the uncertainties about camp and the pre-camp stuff they did in June. And actually several of the SEC teams I thought were well prepared. You think Missouri beat LSU in about week, 3 or 4. And, Mississippi State goes off first game under Mike Leach and blows up on LSU. So I just thought that Sam Pittman and his staff did a tremendous job, and they'll be well prepared going into 2021.
Yeah, I think that the what we heard at Media Day from Sam was, and I'd felt this, but it's the first time I'd really heard him say this, that they were really vanilla on defense. They had not had a spring practice. They coached them in Zoom. Mm-hmm. They weren't sure their players, and he didn't say this, but this was my translation, knew all of the package enough to where they would not make mistakes. And the best way to not make mistakes and give up big plays in the passing game is to be vanilla, rush 3, drop 8. Of course, that turned out to be perfect for Mississippi State, and I guess in some ways for Ole Miss. But they're going to attack on first down, and that they will know their system. And, when you attack, if you take the wrong angle or whatever, you can leave huge gaps. And so that was the thought, is we're not going to make glaring mistakes. But I think they know the system better, and they will be more aggressive in some of the things they do, really on both sides of the ball.
Yeah. This year feels like it's an important year to set the table for the next 3, 4, 5 years. And, the years that are just ahead, that there's a lot of dividend or potential consequence that comes out of what happens this year. Y'all get that feeling, too, that this is a real cornerstone or foundation block for what's to come for Sam? Tom?
I would, Tom, you go.
No, Clay, I'd like to hear what you think.
Thanks.
One of y'all talk.
Defers to the old guy.
Yeah.
Without question, last year was a gimme. I mean, it's no one was going to hold you, put your head down and say we're chopping it off with what happened last year. But I think starting this year, you'll start no passes. No, we're judging everybody on what you're doing, and that lines up for the future. But I also think that for Sam, that's fine with him. I think he feels good about where they're headed. But, yeah, I think this is a critical year in the maturation of the Sam Pittman era.
Yeah, for recruiting, for development. I mean, just for a lot of things, Tom.
Yeah, that's what I was going to touch on, was the recruiting part. They seem to be doing quite well in the recruiting. They've got to get 2 or 3 defensive ends that you look at and go, oh, yeah, man, that guy can rush the passer. And as opposed to going, man, I hope so-and-so can improve his individual technique and is maybe able to get to the passer 4 or 5 times a game. They've got to beat offensive tackles with more regularity as a defensive front, no matter how you pull that off.
Mm-hmm.
But I agree with Clay. Well, yeah, I agree with Clay on the take more chances. But when you do, if you're not all set, then you can give up big plays. But I think that's where it pays dividends to have Grant Morgan and Jalen Catalon making last-minute calls, getting guys in the right places and helping out with your package before the snap is taking place. And, my take on this is there were so many 50-50 games last year, y'all. They won some of them, both the Mississippi games. The Tennessee game, Tennessee dominated in the first half. But the Auburn game and the LSU game and the Missouri game could have gone either way. And I think they're going to have – that's 6. I think they're going to have just as many games that could go either way this year. And they've got to have the fortitude and the stamina in the fourth quarters to win individual battles and then win games.
And my take is you've got so many of these super seniors, and I'm looking at guys, first and foremost like a Myron Cunningham. You mentioned Morgan, who's coming back. You got so many of these guys that you would not otherwise, under any other circumstance, have back. Here's your best chance and probably your last chance to really sneak up on anyone, surprise them, exceed expectations, do some things that otherwise would not be possible, and then really ingrain and drill in the culture and that of toughness into your program with all these mature, older players. I just think this year's important from a lot of those angles that otherwise wouldn't have been possible because a lot of these guys, Clay and Tom, wouldn't be here because they wouldn't be eligible.
Yeah, I think that early in camp, and Tom, you mentioned recruiting and defensive ends. Do they have some defensive ends on campus that maybe that just hadn't emerged yet? Guys like Stewart and Zach Williams, are these guys, Eric Gregory, are they ready to develop into, to big-time SEC defensive ends? Sometimes it takes 3 years, 2 years for that to happen, and they could be difference makers. And then, it's the core of that front seven is where you win football games, and they didn't have, really a huge talent edge in any of those positions except for Jonathan Marshall. And have they gained a little bit there in the offseason? I think they have.
Yeah, I'd like to hope that they have, and I think Zach Williams is in a position to make a move. I'd like to see Mateo Soli gain a little bit more weight and just be harder to block. And then they talked very highly of Trey Williams at media days. Grant Morgan did, and so did Myron Cunningham, about he could be a difference maker. I think all their transfers, Utsey and the others, will certainly push guys to be better.
Ridgeway.
And Isaiah Nichols, if he can be near what Jonathan Marshall gave them, really holding that point, then that's a building block toward it. Look, let's be realistic. They won some games in the SEC. They beat people. They were solid, but there was still a big gap between Alabama and Texas A&M, Florida. And, of course, now they have to go play Georgia. Thanks, SEC, for giving Arkansas Georgia 2 years in a row. But there was a gap between the upper level of the SEC West and where Arkansas was. And they've got to improve a couple, 3 notches before you could even think about them having a chance to beat Bama. Now, A&M, different story. Should have, would have, could have beat them several times over the last few years. But there was a gap last year that was bigger than what we were used to.
Tom, good preview as we get ready for camp. When we talk again on Thursday, we'll be right on the doorstep of practice getting underway. We look forward to visiting with you later in the week.
Awesome. Good to hear from you, Clay, Tommy.